So let's jump into yet another Transformer Slag podcast Patreon listener question. If you want to be part of the Transformer Slag Patreon, check the description below, patreon.com/Protoman. Come join all the coolness, different tiers, different benefits. You could get your name in the end scroll at the bottom tier. You could get a cool access to the Transformer Slag podcast Patreon Discord, where we post all kinds of cool stuff, all kinds of interesting stuff from Transformers lore, even crazy deals that happen weekly within the Transformer world. Just last week, Walmart was liquidating online through price matching their deluxe Earthrise stuff at $2 a piece, and we debuted it there privately in our little Discord for everyone to profit and take advantage of. So be sure to join our Discord too through Patreon. Also, depending on the tier, depending on what tier you're at, you could even get a little gift box in the mail. Shout out to one of our recent patrons of that tier, Silver Screamer. He got a nice little package in the mail of a whole bunch of cool, rare Transformer paraphernalia. And of course, we're here today to talk about it, the Patreon listener question. And we got a Patreon listener question from Massive Gains, who's been with us for a very long time. And this was a question that he asked me. Originally, it wasn't going to be a Patreon listener question. He just wanted to ask me casually. But because it was such an open-ended answer, and it was so long, I figured, you know what, Massive Gains, let's make this the Patreon listener question. There's so much going on here that might as well be. And so here's how it's worded. Hey, Proto, what's up with all the repaints? With Deep Cover and the possible clampdown repaint coming, why is Hasbro repainting so many of these molds in such large numbers? Better yet, why are they re-releasing the same toys from the year prior so closely? It's never been this crazy, has it? Massive Gains. So, it really has. Oh, Summer Child, how people forget the past of Transformers sometimes. Especially when the times were good and Hasbro was making mad money. Look at it this way. Let's dial it all the way back to the beginning. 1984, Generation 1, that first wave of figures. The Autobot cars, the 3 Decepticon jets, the communication expert of Soundwave with his cassettes, Soundwave, Optimus Prime. And of course the mini-bots, but that counts as the cars too. Just that alone, Hasbro launches that wave, and there's no investment needed when that wave is launched, no RDR, nothing like that. Just making the bios, the profiles and all of that. All of those molds, technically, when you think about it, were either repaints or re-releases. They were all stuff that came from the Diaclone and the Microman line, and some of it later on from other sources. Point is, none of it was original product made for Transformers. Hasbro went right out of the gate, 1984, with all of that Japanese product from Takara on the other side of the globe that they were doing between 1978 and 1982. And some straddlers in 1983, but we'll get into that later. So, right away off the bat, Transformers started with no need of investment from a design standpoint with the product. So technically, everything from that first year was a re-release or repaint, pretty much. Look within the line itself. Right away within the line itself, you had the 3 Seeker jets that were repaints of each other. Granted, they would go on to be famous characters with their own individuality, but from an early perspective, you could just go, hey, look at that, 3 repaints right there. Oh, look at those 2 cassettes, Rumble and Frenzy. Just 2 repaints right there. Oh, Laserbeak and Buzzsaw, 2 repaints right there. And that's all within the first year. And then we could go into the repaint remolds of Ironhide and Ratchet and so on and so forth. So it's right away, out of the bat, you could have that argument, but at the same time, Hasbro was doing it right out of the gate. And when you go into 1985, that trend continues. No investment needed. Most of, if not all of that second year in 1985 was old product from Japan ported over under the Transformer emblem. Obviously, other stuff started coming from like Toy Box, like, Omega Supreme with the Korean origins, or same thing with Shockwave. But in general, a majority of that popular top tier the peak of G1 popularity in the 80s, 1985, when Transformers was this, household brand, everything that Hasbro had there, they didn't even have to design. It was all ready to go from the past. So again, you could argue, like, they really didn't have to do anything. Everything was just brought from the past. Didn't have to make anything new, no investments, and they were just raking in the cash. Just raking it in. When you get to 1986, then it starts to fall off. Then it's like, okay, Ultra Magnus, Powered Convoy, late, Diaclone kind of design, that was brought over, but otherwise everything else was original creations. And that's when Hasbro started feeling the squeeze, because at that point they had to make their own stuff. Obviously they were working with Takara, but they were making their own stuff at that point. Now stuff had to be made in real time, invested, people had to be hired, and that stuff had to be made in that moment. And then we started to notice Transformers. Coincidentally, Transformers took a dive. All of a sudden, Hasbro dials it back on the product. And there was a huge surprise for them, because they realized that Transformers wasn't the big brand anymore after 1986, 1987. Sure, you could argue all the outside factors too. Ninja Turtles would roll around in 1987 at that point and become popular in 88 and 89. There's a whole bunch of other factors too. Transformers was getting boring. Oh, maybe the 86 movie, killing Optimus Prime. There's a lot of other factors too, you could argue. But one thing that is key is that from the financial standpoint from Hasbro, the first year that they actually had to make their own product for the future moving forward, and they felt it after 2 years of not having to make anything. And going back to the argument that you said about also them re-releasing products, another advantage that they had between 1985 and 1986 is you would have product that came out in 1985, like the mini bots, like let's say Warpath or Beachcomber or Perceptor or Blaster. Those were 1985 product. But in 1986, that product was still prevalent and still sold as 1986 product. There was recases. There's different mild variants if you're like a crazy running change collector, but there's mild variants out there of 1986 Blasters, 1986 mini bots, 1986 Perceptors. So a lot of old product from the year before was then re-released in the following year to fill out the line, because 86 was going to be a lot of new stuff. Kind of is reminiscent of what's going on today. We have a much lighter Transformer Kingdom, but it has RC in there from Earthrise. We have Optimus Prime, the leader class from Earthrise. Kind of in the same situation. And then when you march forward, when you look at 87, 88, 89, at that point, they were really dialing it back on how many new figures were coming out a year. They really had to dial it back because Transformers just wasn't the popular brand anymore. And by that point, it just kind of phased out. And then when you get into the big reboot for Transformers, which was G2, what did they do when G2 went right out of the gate? They're going back hard with Transformers again. Ninja Turtles ruled the world for a bit. Let's go back to Transformers. Let's make it the big famous brand it was. And what did they do right out of the gate? They played it safe financially, Hasbro. Right away, all of those repaints of previously existing G1 molds, whether it be the Dinobots, whether it be the Constructicons, whether it be Jazz and Sideswipe, there was and Optimus Prime. Yes, there was some retools, some little launcher here, voice activated box or something, but in general, these were brand new repaints of previously existing molds because they were playing it safe. Yeah, there were some new molds with G2, don't get me wrong, but there was also a lot of stuff that the line pretty much sat on that was from the past. I'm pretty sure if legally they could have just reissued G1 G1 Megatron as a gun, they would have. We wouldn't have had the big green Megatron attacks tank Megatron that we all know and love today culturally. We probably would have got some wacky colored G1 Megatron 1984 gun, maybe in purple. Who knows? Who knows what those radical 90s colors would have been? Maybe that safety Megatron that we saw years ago, which was like purple and orange, maybe it would have been those colors. Who knows? Who knows what would have happened if they would have been allowed to use that instead of having to make a brand new Megatron from the ground up. So it even continued back then. They were playing it safe. When Transformers was at its lowest, where it wasn't even a viable IP or brand anymore, and Beast Wars came along. Then it started brand new, but it wasn't even Hasbro. It was Kenner, their sister company. Everything was started fresh, and then, no surprise, even if you look at Beast Wars, as the line progressed, there was entire parts of the line that were repaints of previous stuff. The Fox Kids repaints is one best example of that. By the time the line was starting to cool down Beast Wars, they were just repainting every previously existing mold they could. And that would continue, because a lot of those Beast Wars molds would end up finding themselves in other places repainted to get some mileage out of those molds to make up for the investment, whether it be in the Universe 1.0 line or even that of the Armada line. Some of those Beast Wars molds showed up. And of course, they would show up in Beast Machines too. So nothing was wasted. Nothing was wasted. And that's what it pretty much falls into, is that, and I could keep going and going, by the time they get to Robots in Disguise and Armada, you're seeing repaints within a line quite frequently, especially when you're looking at the mini-con, especially when you're looking at characters that got power-up body colors, whether it be like, Hotshot to Power Link's Hotshot, and literally everyone across the entire spectrum. And then when you get into even Cybertron, where it's like, oh, we'll repaint every single mold, but it'll be a different character. It's always existed. It's always existed, and it's always been a thing, because Hasbro learned their lesson all those years ago that they were very lucky back in 1984 and 1985, where they went out of the gate and they didn't have to worry about anything, because Takara took all that front and all that investment back in 78 to 81, maybe a little bit 82. And that's where they were very lucky. So Hasbro now learned their lesson that whenever they do a mold now, they got to make the best of it. If they're going to put the time into making that Sideswipe Siege mold all those years ago at the beginning of Siege, they're going to make sure that they repaint the hell out of him so that he gets every possible iteration that makes sense from a viable trademark standpoint. And I mean, we're not getting dumb repaints. We're getting repaints that are pretty much based in lore, or something that's part of, a piece of Transformers history, whether it be an unreleased color scheme or something. It's not just silly repaints. We're getting stuff that's legitimate repaints. So at the same time, Hasbro's able to milk it and get as much as they can. And they've been doing it forever. They've been doing it forever. They learned their lesson back then. You can't look at a single Transformers line, big or small, that doesn't have some kind of repaint safety equity put into it, where they're saving money by repainting characters. Look at even a small line like Machine Wars. Machine Wars is like less than 12 figures, and that entire line consisted of either unreleased, already designed flip changers, or pre-existing molds that came from the United Kingdom or late G1, early G2 UK. Like, there's a whole history even with that, and some of the art even with Machine Wars is recycled. They recycled art, and then they just kind of photoshopped it and changed it a little bit. So there's this method that they go about it, that's how they save money. Transformers is a lot more complicated than a lot of other toy lines. A single Transformer toy, whether it be even like a small Scout class or something, possesses more pieces and parts than your average action figure. And there's a lot more that go into it. When you're doing a Luke Skywalker figure, there's no real R&D and engineering that's really needed. You kind of even could imagine it in your head, and because there's no transformation, you're just talking the articulation parts and pieces, and it's pretty easy. Transformers is a whole other bag and a whole other animal, and it's an engineering thing, and it's much more complicated. And as a result, whenever a figure is made, they gotta find a way to somehow repaint it. Is there Transformers that have been designed and have never gotten a repaint? Of course, I could think of tons that never got a repaint, especially when you're talking some of the more smaller stuff, or even some masterpieces that blow my mind. Like think about like something like Masterpiece Starsaber. That was probably a huge investment, put all that time and energy into doing it, and they never even did like a silly black repaint, or even like a some kind of exclusive black repaint, or like a lucky draw. They just never touched that mold again. And it's not that it didn't sell well or something, it's just some toys they just never repainted. But then you look at some other more expensive, bigger tier items, like let's say, I don't know, Primus, or even the Unicron, and I'm not talking the HasLab one, I'm talking the Armada mold, where that thing found multiple repaints, both of them, the Primus and the Unicron, where they made sure that all that time and energy that went into a Supreme class toy got a whole bunch of repaints out of it. I think and now that we mention it, when we think about Supreme Cheetor from Beast Machines, that was such a disaster that they didn't touch that mold ever again. They did that one and done. So that's the flip side of it. But the point is that they need to make their money. And it's not me trying to shill for them. It's more just that's pretty much the logic of it, of the business. And they were very lucky all those years ago, and they'll never get that kind of luck again where there's some kind of line that's already pre-put together. I mean, they've entertained the idea in the past, where I remember I talked with Aaron Archer about how they were thinking of bringing over the Web Divers line and making it a Transformers line because it was all put together already. And all they had to do was just package it up and put it out here for the Western market. And even with Gal Geiger and the Brave stuff, they were thinking about at one point too. It was in the discussion. It didn't happen in the end, but it was in the discussion because that kind of situation is so much more favorable for them from a financial standpoint because there's less investment. And it's something that the money was already spent and invested and made all those years ago when it was when it was an Eastern property. Now you could bring it over as a Western property, and all you got to worry about is, packaging it up, copyright, and all that stuff. So that's pretty much it. So it's been just as bad back then as it is today. It really is. Like, it's just that back then it was so new and fresh, we weren't really paying attention as much. And sometimes the eyeballs are elsewhere. I mean, even something as beloved as Beast Wars that was so revolutionary has tons of repaints in its DNA. Tons of it. And the odd thing is a lot of that stuff today is worth a lot of money because most people slept on it. Because, ew, what's this ugly repaint of Waspinator? Oh, I don't want it anymore. Oh, what's this black repaint of Tarantulas? Oh, I don't want it. And now they're $80, $90, $100 items today. So it is what it is, like I always say. And so it's something that it's a part of the DNA and the culture of our brand. And I mean, at the end of the day, if it's overwhelming to you as a completist, that's where you kind of just have to, pick your battles and choose when to buy and when it's more financially stable for you to do so. And if you're someone who's not a completist and it just doesn't interest you, then lucky for you, you don't have to buy it. That's the best part, I always say. Look, there's tons of stuff that comes out now that just doesn't interest me that I just don't buy. You don't need to spend the money. You can put the money elsewhere. But that hopefully that more or less gives a clearer picture of what's going on right now and how it really is a strong reflection of what was going on in the past. And I hope that answers your question, Massive Gains. And once again, if you want to be like Massive Gains and be part of the Patreon, hang out with us, join us, and be part of the awesomeness that is the Transformer Slag podcast, patreon.com/Protoman, the Transformer Slag podcast, and the Patreon listener question.